The best and worst moments for the Boston Bruins in 2024 and what might be ahead here in 2025.
You're Locked On Bruins, your daily podcast on the Boston Bruins. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Bruins fans, and welcome back to the Locked On Boston Bruins podcast. I'm your host, Ian McLaren, and this is a daily show where we discuss all things Spoked B. Today is Tuesday, December 31st, and I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Bruins part of your day every day. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and it is the final day of 2024. How is that even possible? On today's podcast, we're going to look back at this past year, discuss some of the best and worst moments for the Boston Bruins, and take a look at what might be ahead for this team. Of course, the Bruins are playing today, 12:30 p.m. against the Washington Capitals. It's a game we previewed yesterday, their final game of 2024, and interesting to see how they end the year after an up-and-down weekend against the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, before we discuss the Bruins 2024, quick reminder, you can find the podcast on social media at Locked NHL Bruins, and you can find me, my hockey thoughts, dad jokes, at Ian C. McLaren. I am a lifelong Boston Bruins fan. I've been covering this team for various outlets for 20 years or so. Was a full-time hockey writer for The Score for about 5 years. TheScore.com, based up here in Toronto. I live in Guelph, Ontario, and I've been hosting this podcast since 2019. So 5 years of Boston Bruins coverage here on Locked On Boston Bruins. And we look back at this year, some of the best and worst moments. Let's start with the good stuff, shall we? And of course, there was no better moment for the Boston Bruins than David Pastrnak scoring the overtime game winner in Game 7 against the Toronto Maple Leafs to give the Bruins perhaps a unexpected playoff series win over the Maple Leafs. There was a lot of chatter, a lot of belief that perhaps this was the year that the Maple Leafs finally took the Bruins out of the playoffs. David Pastrnak didn't have a great series up into that point. He had been called out by then head coach Jim Montgomery heading into Game 7, or after Game 6. Montgomery said Pasta needs to step up, and that he did after defenseman Hampus Lindholm dumped the puck in, and it bounced right out to Pastrnak, who collected it and put a backhand past Ilya Samsonov for the overtime game winner, propelling the Boston Bruins to the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. Just a fantastic moment for the Bruins, and again, one that was perhaps a bit unexpected. We can talk about the Leafs missing Austin Matthews, William Nylander for some chunks of that series. But nevertheless, it was the Bruins who got the job done, won a playoff round in a year that was supposed to be a transition season for this team. So it doesn't really get much better than that for the Boston Bruins. Now, when you talk about other top moments, when we think specifically of the playoffs, you can't overlook Jeremy Swayman's performance in the playoffs. That, for me, was certainly one of the highlights of the year. Yes, he's off to a tough start. We'll discuss that a bit later on here this season. But when you look back at his playoff run from this past spring, just unbelievable how good he was for this team. 12 games. Linus Ullmark only got in one of those, the Game 2 against Toronto, where we thought perhaps there would be a goalie rotation. Yes, he went 6-6, Swayman did, but he had a .933 save percentage in those 12 games. Pretty much the big reason why the Bruins were able to push Toronto to a Game 7 why they had any hope of beating the Florida Panthers in round 2. Of course, we'll discuss that later on in terms of some of the lesser moments, but Jeremy Swayman certainly played like one of the best goalies in the NHL during that stretch, and that was kind of what led to his contract stalemate, which of course we'll discuss a bit later on. But signing Jeremy Swayman to a contract of 8 years in terms of term, 8.25 million AAV. Yes, it came after a lengthy stalemate. It caused him to miss the entirety of training camp, and he is not quite where we expect him to be this season in terms of production or save percentage at the very least, because he missed training camp. But locking Jeremy Swayman down for the future was a must. And you can argue that perhaps he's a bit overpaid, and based on his numbers this season, certainly he seems overpaid. He's tied for the 41st best save percentage in the NHL this season. But locking up Jeremy Swayman versus completely alienating him or trading him is and was something that they had to do. So that, of course, is a win. You can look at July 1st and consider the signings of Elias Lindholm, Nikita Zadorov. Those were seen as positives by the Boston Bruins coming out of free agency. It hasn't paid dividends quite yet. The ROI on those yet to be determined. But according to Don Sweeney, Cam Neely, those were important signings for a team that had failed to match up well with the Florida Panthers in the past couple of playoff years, and perhaps this will help them this time around if indeed they are able to make the playoffs. We can't not mention Brad Marchand with some incredible milestones for this team. He surpassed Cam Neely with his 56th playoff goal during the first round series against the Maple Leafs, becoming the Bruins' all-time playoffs goal leader. He reached the 400 NHL goal mark back in April. He played in his 1,000th game. He recorded his 500th assist, and he recently set the Bruins record for the longest point streak for a player of his age, over 36 years old. Brad Marchand has developed into a great captain for this team, taking over from his best friend, Patrice Bergeron, and he is proving to be, despite a bit of a slow start to this season, coming off some off-season procedures, he's proving to be quite durable with some longevity, and we'll see what that means for his future with this team moving forward, because he is set to become an unrestricted free agent this summer. Now, when it comes to some more recent highlights, the Bruins, tough start. We'll discuss that coming up, but they did have that amazing comeback recently against Calgary. They did have that amazing game just last week against the Washington Capitals. Third period goals from Elias Lindholm, Charlie Coyle. One of the highlights we have to mention, of course, is the culmination of the centennial celebration. December 1st, it was highlighted by some amazing appearances by Bruins legends, including Willie O'Ree, who I always love to see coming out, a new bear statue outside TD Garden by the same guy who created the Bobby Orr one. And the Bruins won that 100th anniversary game with a 6-3 decision over the Montreal Canadiens. Charlie McAvoy, Charlie Coyle, each scoring twice. A dominant performance that honored the franchise's rich history. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch of stuff. If you have some more top moments for this team from this past year, hit me up on social media or in the comments. And coming up as the podcast continues, we'll look at some of the not so great moments for this team from 2024. Have you ever been scratching your head wondering where your money is going, and then suddenly you realize that you have all these subscriptions that you forgot to cancel. It's definitely happened to me. And Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings, brings everything together in one place: subscriptions, spending habits, even the goals you want to hit in 2025. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions alone, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. No more stressing about budgeting every month. Rocket Money has you covered at rocketmoney.com/lockedon. We discussed some of the highlights for the Boston Bruins in 2024. What about the lowlights? Some of the more forgettable parts of this past year. We can't, of course, start without focusing on the playoff loss to the Florida Panthers for the second year in a row. The Panthers getting Boston's number despite that stellar play from Jeremy Swayman in the playoffs. He gave them every opportunity to get in that series and force it to a Game 7. The injury to Brad Marchand, which was the result of a pretty gross and ugly play by Sam Bennett. Losing him for a few games certainly did not help this team. And it was a tough way to end what was a pretty solid 2023-24 for this Boston Bruins team. Again, it was a team that was in transition. They had been relying on some guys who came in and, playing on some lower contracts like James Van Riemsdyk, Danton Heinen, Kevin Shattenkirk, etc. They got the most out of some of these guys, but were not able to get it done against the Florida Panthers. But still a pretty positive result. One of the worst moments for me for this team, and perhaps it was inevitable, but it was the trading of Linus Ullmark. The Bruins had been so successful over the past few years because of, in large part, because of the tandem of Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman. Both guys wanted to be top dog. Jeremy Swayman needed a new contract. Linus Ullmark, his contract was up at the end of this season. He was going to be needing an extension, and he got that with the Ottawa Senators after being traded back in the summer. The return for me was a bit mid, although Mark Kostelik has come in and given this team an injection of offense, grit, toughness, face punching. Eunice Korpisalo, I didn't love taking on his contract or 75% of it, despite the fact he's outplayed Jeremy Swayman to this point in the season. They wanted to get a first-round pick. We'll see what Dean Letourneau ends up becoming, but splitting up that tandem, ending the goalie hugs, there's no question that was a tough moment for the Boston Bruins this year. Couple that with the departure of Jake DeBrusk, a guy that the Bruins had drafted, developed. He'd become a very good two-way forward. Yes, there was some inconsistency in terms of his production. There was the trade request. There was, some very real mental health struggles that he went through, specifically in those COVID years. But he was a very important player for this team. And he killed penalties. He scored goals. He did all the things for this team. Losing him in free agency for nothing was a tough pill to swallow, as he and Danton Heinen and Derek Forbort all signed with the Vancouver Canucks in the offseason. And DeBrusk right now on pace for 37 goals, 26 assists, 63 points in a rejuvenated role career in Vancouver. And Love to see it for him, but the Bruins could certainly use him right now as they're missing top 6 winger to be sure. And then, of course, they did sign Jeremy Swayman, but the whole process of that was very unfortunate. The way he was pretty open about resetting the goalie market. Cam Neely came out and revealed the number, saying he had 64 million reasons to sign. That was a pretty ugly time and an uncertain time for this team. Thankfully, he did sign, but that whole process was certainly not something that that we loved to see, and it did certainly affect the Bruins to begin this season. It was a very, very ugly start to the season for the Boston Bruins. Coming off that playoff exit, they began the season with a record of 4-6-1. They allowed 42 goals in their first 11 games, their worst defensive start since 1995. And they had some pretty lopsided losses in there. An 8-2 loss to Carolina, a bad loss to Dallas, a 5-1 loss to the Columbus Blue Jackets, which led to the firing of head coach Jim Montgomery. He had led the team to a record-breaking season just 2 years ago. Jack Adams Trophy winner, was hired less than a week later by the St. Louis Blues. Very real argument to be made for the fact that he's not the problem, or he wasn't the problem. Maybe he wanted to be in St. Louis all along and had his eye on that job. The contract discussions between the two sides weren't going very far, but to lose or to fire Jim Montgomery so soon after that record-breaking season, so soon after firing Bruce Cassidy, who was quickly scooped up by Vegas, Montgomery joins Claude Julien, who was fired and was quickly hired after his firing from the Bruins several years ago. It's a bad look for the Bruins and really puts the microscope back on Don Sweeney, Cam Neely, and the makeup of this team. Special teams haven't been good so far this season. They've had discipline issues. They have turned things around a little bit under Sacco. But again, just a couple weeks ago, some pretty bad losses to Winnipeg, Seattle. They had a bad loss last week to Columbus. Hopefully they can end the year on a strong note today with a victory over the Washington Capitals, a team that they arguably had one of their best games of the season against just last week. Overall, the Bruins in 2024 played 85 regular season games. They had a record of 45, 27, and 13. That's a .606 point percentage, which puts them 11th in the NHL. They allowed 2.96 goals per game. They scored 2.96 goals per game. They allowed 2.88 goals per game, I should say. But again, it's hard to compare last season's team to this season's start. The additions of Lindholm, Zadorov have not paid off as of yet. Although you could argue Lindholm has been turning a corner lately and looks more like the player they were expecting. So hopefully that bodes well for the 2025 portion of the season and moving forward, since both Lindholm and Zadorov are under long-term contracts. And speaking of Lindholm, of course, one of the down moments for the Bruins so far this season was an injury to Hampus Lindholm, who was arguably the Bruins' best defenseman and player this season before getting injured. So, loss to the Panthers, trading Ullmark, the Swayman saga, firing Montgomery, a tough start to this season, some free agent signings that haven't paid off quite yet. Those are some tough starts for the Bruins here in the early part of the 2024-25 season. What might 2025 have in store for this team? Well, we'll discuss that here as the podcast continues. The Bruins have one more game here in 2024, and that will come this afternoon against the Washington Capitals. It's a game we previewed on yesterday's podcast. It will be a tough one for the Bruins. The Capitals, currently one of the best teams in the NHL. If you look at the Eastern Conference standings, the Capitals sit first in terms of point percentage, 1 point back of the New Jersey Devils with a game in hand. They also have the best goal differential in the Eastern Conference, second best in the NHL, behind only the Winnipeg Jets. So it could be a tough go for the Bruins this afternoon, but we thought that last week. And of course, they came out with a big win over Washington heading into the Christmas break. Now, the good news for the Bruins, they do have their first round pick this year. They had to trade Ullmark last year to recoup their first round pick, so they can keep building their prospect pool. They don't have a second round pick that was traded to the Washington Capitals almost 2 years ago now, as they added Dmitry Orlov and Garnet Hathaway. They do have some players who will be unrestricted free agents this summer that they will have to make some decisions on. Beginning with Brad Marchand, of course. Don Sweeney has said they have been discussing, and they want to make Marchand a Bruin for life. He has been on a very team-friendly contract for the last several seasons. Perhaps they may have to pay him more than what a 36, 37-year-old is worth, but he's still playing at a very high level, second on the team in scoring, and coming off a very lengthy point streak. So he's as important to this team as anybody. They got to get him locked up. A guy that may not have that same fate, and I believe won't be a member of the Bruins come next season, is Trent Frederic. Now, Frederic has not been very good this season. I haven't been the biggest Frederic guy over the last, several years since he joined the Bruins after being drafted in the first round. I had come around to his game with some more defensive responsibility, some bigger offensive seasons. He hasn't recorded a point since December 2nd. Not what you want to see from a guy who could establish himself as a core member of this team with the departure of Jake DeBrusk, Danton Heinen. He has been put back at center lately, which may not be helping him, taking on some more responsibility on the third line. But he's a guy that I wouldn't be surprised if they trade before the March 7th deadline, because it really seems as though he's on his way out. And I would not be shocked at all if he signs with Montgomery and his hometown Blues this coming offseason. Justin Brazeau, Cole Koepke, also unrestricted free agents. On the blue line, you'll have Parker Witherspoon coming up, needing a new deal. In terms of restricted free agents, Morgan Geekie, he's a guy you're going to have to make a decision on in terms of, similar to Frederic, you want to keep him, move on. Oliver Wahlstrom, who they added off waivers, is a restricted free agent. John Beecher is a restricted free agent. Mark Kastelic, RFA, and importantly as well, Mason Lohrei. It'll be very interesting to see what his next contract will look like. Right now, he's challenging McAvoy for the lead in scoring among defensemen on this team. Looking down at the AHL level, Georgi Merkulov is a guy who could be is a restricted free agent as well. He looked good in his time up with the team recently, so they're going to have to decide what they want to do with him. In terms of playoff outlook, well, right now the Bruins are indeed in a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. Point percentage wise, they rank 7th ahead of the Ottawa Senators for 8th spot, with Pittsburgh, Columbus, Philadelphia maybe with outside shots at challenging. The New York Rangers continue their dive from President's Trophy champions last year. Now they're 14th in the East in terms of point percentage right now. The Bruins not inspiring much confidence if they did make the playoffs, with a minus 14 goal differential The only Eastern Conference playoff team right now with a negative goal differential in the West. The top 8 teams there's only one team with a negative goal differential, and that's Vancouver. So if you make the playoffs, anything can happen, to be sure. But I'm not super convinced that the Bruins could make a lot of noise if they got into the playoffs. We're likely looking at another one and done. They'll have to make a decision on Joe Sacco, whether they want to remove the interim tag from him and make him the permanent head coach, or if they will explore external hires, thank him for his interim service and move on. I mean, so far he's warranted an extended look, and we'll see how the season ends here. But they need Jeremy Swayman to turn things around if they have any shot at doing anything in 2025. They need David Pastrnak to raise his shooting percentage above 8.6, where it sits right now, and closer to his season or his career average of 13.6. If they have any chance of doing anything, those are their two most important players, along with Charlie McAvoy on the back end. Get Hampus Lindholm back, get Swayman back to his regular play, get Pastrnak scoring more regularly. Maybe 2025 can have some special aspects to it, but I'm not super optimistic. I'm usually a glass half full kind of guy. Just kind of the glass is half full right now. It's a pretty mid team, let's be honest. There are some things to get excited about. Some younger guys like Matt Poitras, Fabian Lysell, Merkulov excelling at the AHL level. Mason Lohrei, despite some flaws defensively, has really stepped up this season. And there are some things to be excited about with regards to this team. I don't think it's necessarily going to be downwards trajectory to a full rebuild, but there's certainly some work to be done and real questions to be asked about Don Sweeney's job security if things don't turn around within this calendar year. All right, that's it for today's episode of Locked On Boston Bruins, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me here today and throughout the year. I really do appreciate the support. It has been a bit of a tough year on a personal level with some professional challenges, personal challenges, but it has been a joy to jump on the podcast each and every day and talk about our favorite hockey team. Please do subscribe if you have not already on your favorite podcast app, on YouTube, and please do check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast next, where Steele and Flip will give you all the latest fantasy tips to help you get an edge over your competition this week. Hope you all have a happy new year. Please take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll talk to you again here on the next episode of Locked On Boston Bruins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your favorite team every single day.